May it please the court?
Court is pleased.
Gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next several weeks, the evidence in this case is going to show you that Felicita Perez is a woman in waiting. For a long time, she searched for her daughter and her grandchildren in crowds. Then she looked for their bodies in the woods. This month, it will be 4 long years since she has seen or heard from her precious babies. And now she waits for the call that someone has found them. She waits for the call that means that they are finally coming home. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Ryan Will. This is Mark Johnson. At counsel table is Brian Ford. He's the lead investigator on this case, and he'll be assisting us through trial. And together it is our honor to present the case to you against Luis Toledo. During the early morning hours of October 23rd, 2013, the defendant, Luis Toledo, killed his wife, Yesenia Suarez, in a violent and brutal way. That same night, her 2 children were also killed. As I stand before you, none of the bodies have ever been found. As you heard during jury selection, the defendant has been charged with the first-degree murder of 2 children. First is Michael Elijah Otto. He goes by Elijah, and you'll hear him referred to as Elijah throughout the case. Elijah was 8 years old at the time of his murder. Second is Talia Otto. She was 9 years old at the time of her murder. He's also been charged with second-degree murder for his wife, Yesenia Suarez, who was 28. And he's been charged with tampering with physical evidence. It is our belief that the evidence will demonstrate in this case that the defendant killed all 3 individuals, then covered his crime by discarding the bodies and concealing his wrongdoing. Death is always tragic, but the evidence in this case will reflect that these crimes were senseless and that they were brutal. As a jury, it's your responsibility to review the evidence and return a verdict for the highest offense that has been proven beyond and to the exclusion of a reasonable doubt. For 2 centuries, the criminal justice system, and more specifically the jury, has allowed citizens to settle their disputes and provided the state an avenue to hold people accountable for their crimes. Over the course of the next several weeks, the evidence will clearly show that Luis Toledo is responsible for all 3 murders. In order to fully understand how we intend to prove our case, let me offer you an introduction. As I told you, Yesenia Suarez was a 28-year-old mother of 2 at the time of her murder. She was a vibrant young woman. She had many friends, she had a large family, and she had a bright future. After her children were born, Yesenia, or Jessie, as her mother called her, returned to school. She wanted a better life for her children. A student at Rylands College, she was making good grades and working on her last credits for graduation. Jessie didn't have much spare time. In fact, if she ever got a Saturday without rules or without children, she wouldn't know what to do with it. You see, in addition to her academic work, Jessie had a full-time job in the HR department at American K-9. AM K-9, as it's better known, is a civilian contractor in charge of training and deploying K-9 officers for law enforcement agencies, for the military, and for paramilitary organizations. These trained dogs are invaluable resources in the line of duty. And in her line of employment, Jessie worked closely with the handlers that arranged for our K-9 partners to be deployed all over the world. When she wasn't in school or working, Yesenia Suarez spent time with her family and friends. She had 2 young children, Michael Elijah Otto and Talia Otto. The 2 children were the product of a previous marriage. You'll hear during this trial that they were born between the marriage of Yesenia Suarez and Michael Otto. The young boy shares his father's name. Throughout the course of the trial, you'll occasionally hear Michael's name, and I don't want you to be confused. Though he may appear and testify in this trial, it won't be until the penalty phase, if we get there. The two children were what's sometimes called Irish twins, meaning that they were born in the same calendar year. And roughly 10 months apart, they were as close as two children can be. They were great friends, and they had all the activity and curiosity that you would expect for two children of that age. They did well in school, they participated in youth activities, and they maintained a close relationship with family and friends. During the course of this trial, you'll likely hear how Yesenia Suarez and her children came to know the defendant. You'll hear that their relationship started about 4 years prior to the murders, and that the two were married soon after that they met. You'll hear that Yesenia's mother, Felicita Perez, and Yesenia's best friend, Sabrina Newell, another witness in this case, neither one of them particularly liked the defendant. There may have been a time that both thought he was good for the children, but they maintained that he was a bad match for Jesse. Rather than destroy the relationship with a young woman in love, the two stood silent and allowed this marriage to take place. Over the years, there were up and downs. As many young families, they struggled with finances, but they ultimately had enough money to raise the children and acquire several large ticket items. You'll hear the evidence in this case shows that the defendant was occasionally out of work and that he took primary responsibility for the care of the children while Jesse kept them afloat. With her income, they were able to finance a home and her new Honda Accord, a vehicle that will be mentioned frequently in this case. They were only married 2 years, just a little less actually. And as the years rolled by, the defendant tried to make more of himself. He had recently enrolled in barber college, and though he was advancing toward a career, his slow start and inability to earn significant money was a source of tension and often the subject of fights. Similarly, the manner in which he cared for her children frequently was part of the dispute. Though the children were always healthy and happy, Yesenia Suarez had high hopes for her children. She wanted their grades to be perfect. The standards were high, and any failure to achieve was blamed on the defendant as caretaker and homework monitor. By the fall of 2013, Yesenia Suarez and Luis Toledo were experiencing a relationship in decline. There were many reasons for the failing relationship, but the arguments consistently focused on several recurring themes. Yesenia Suarez was a woman intent on improving her life. During the course of this trial, you have an opportunity to read several hundred text messages in the days leading up to her murder. You'll find that she was often unhappy with her husband and his failure to achieve. You'll read her thoughts about success and upward mobility, and you'll get a sense of the image that she was trying to create. While there may have been a time that Luis Toledo made her happy, it will be clear that she was leaving him behind. By her word and her action, she was no longer interested in a relationship with the defendant. As jurors, many of you may find her manner distasteful. Many of you may find her actions immoral. But keep in mind two important things. What you see of her life is merely a glimpse. It's a glimpse of a woman at a time in her life when she was fighting for a better future. And the second thing, and most importantly, she's not the one on trial here in this courtroom. The relevant time period for this case starts October 13th, 2013. And it ends just a few days after the murders occurred on October 23rd, 2013. For the next several weeks, everything that you will hear and see focuses on this short but intense window of life in the lives of our victims. And in this courtroom, as in life, information requires a context to have any meaning. When Yesenia Suarez left for a business trip on October 13th, 2013, she was a woman looking forward to a future. She was searching for a freedom and stability that she didn't find with the defendant. And she already had one foot out the door. When the arguments started again, she didn't want to hear them. Yesenia Suarez seemed intent to end the relationship and move on with her life. While in Alabama on this work trip, she had an affair with a coworker, a man named Kevin Dredden. During this 3-day interlude with another man, you'll read text messages between Yesenia Suarez and her husband, Luis Toledo. You'll see his suspicion grow. At times, you'll sense his frustration. And you'll watch as his hostility rises through the exchange of heated words and these heated text messages. The evidence will clearly demonstrate that this was the beginning of the end for Yesenia Suarez. Keep in mind, she didn't admit the affair. She didn't confirm it for the defendant until her final day of life. Maybe that's what drove him to such lengths. Maybe that's the reason for his behavior to be so extreme. Our job as the state is not to judge the defendant for his emotion in learning of his wife's infidelity. Rather, our job is to present the evidence that still exists in the form of text messages and conversations that this defendant had regarding the end of his marriage. When Yesenia Suarez returned home on the night of October 16th, things were not the same as when she left. While she was gone, she had had enough. There was no progress. It was the same arguments. It was the same excuses. On October the 16th, Yesenia Suarez told her husband that she was done. She told the defendant through text message that she no longer wanted him to be a part of her life and that she didn't want him to be a part of the children's either. That night, when she came home, she found an angry husband, one that confronted her. And according to the text messages that they sent on October 17th, the next morning, a husband that threw her stuff all over the house. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an accurate picture of daily life in their home. The text messages are a permanent reflection of their feelings for one another and a description of the events that occurred between them. In these text messages, you will see the relationship continue to decline the closer we get to the final moments of her existence. We learn through his words and his deeds that he is completely obsessed. He is driven to learn whether his wife had an affair and with whom. When he can't access her phone to look in the contents of her phone, he prints the phone records and recruits friends to help him search them, line by line. He needs to know who she's calling and how she spends her time. Robin Roberts, a classmate of the defendants at Barber College, will tell you that the defendant brought her a manila envelope containing the phone history of Yesenia Suarez. He asked her for her assistance in finding his wife's lover. On Friday, October 18th, 2 days after she returned from the business trip, Luis Toledo had been unsuccessful in finding who that person was. Luis Toledo installed something called an SMS tracker on the phone of Yesenia Suarez. You'll learn during the course of the trial that SMS tracker is a modern-day application for a smartphone. It installs on your device just as any game, text message, or music application would. During the course of this trial, you'll hear from the designer of the application, how it works, and why it was developed. You'll learn that this is a real-time, minute-by-minute, live data transmission from the phone of Yesenia Suarez to the attention of Luis Toledo. And through this electronic spyware, he can see everything his wife does as she does it. The device lets him know the GPS data for where she is. It lets him know the calls that she makes. It lets him know and read the emails she receives. It lets him also read the text messages that she sends and receives, both with friends and her lover. And finally, it lets him know the internet searches that she conducts. There is literally nothing that he can't learn about his wife through this massive and gross invasion of her privacy. In the text messages on October 18th, you'll see him try to disguise what he's done. He tells his wife that he has a virus on his phone and that her phone may have it too. That this virus appears as a blue bird and that her phone was probably also infected. When you hear from the developers of SMS Tracker, you'll learn that their company logo is a blue bird. The messages about the virus are merely the defendant's feeble attempt to cover what he's done. Later, you'll hear him admit to the police that he installed spyware on her phone and that he was watching what she was doing every minute of every day as it was happening. On October 20th, when Yesenia Suarez searched for cheap hotels in Central Florida, Luis Toledo read about it right on his phone. The defendant saw it all. He watched his wife narrow her search for hotels along the I-4 corridor where she could meet her lover, whomever that might be. All the while, the fights continued at home. On October 21st, 2013, Yesenia Suarez stood firm and said that she would not change her mind. The text messages say, "I will not recant. I want a divorce." With those messages, the evidence will show that the stage has been set for the last day of her life on earth. On October 22nd, 2013, Luis Toledo finally has his suspicion confirmed. At 8:51 in the morning, Yesenia Suarez begins chatting with her lover by text message. Because of the SMS tracker that he installed on her phone, not only can he see what she's saying, but he now knows the identity of this man. He's able to read every word. For almost an hour, they talked about their relationship, and they scheduled a rendezvous for later in the day. Every single word was read by the defendant, Luis Toledo, as it was happening. Now, at this point in the opening, I should note that you'll be able to read the communication that exists between the individuals involved in this case. You'll be able to experience the short window of their lives, reliving each and every moment and every single conversation that they had. After the defendant killed his wife, her phone was recovered by law enforcement. They were able to forensically examine and preserve the device so that her words could be presented here. Not only will you see the things she said to her husband, but you'll also see what she said to her lover. And at the end of this trial, you'll be able to draw your own conclusions about what happened in this case and why. Opening statement, for that matter, anything that the lawyers say in this case, is not evidence. Evidence is what the witnesses say on the stand and present in the form of exhibits for your review here in this courtroom. Opening statement is merely a time for the lawyers to describe what they expect the evidence will show, basically creating a lens through which you can view this world here in this courtroom. Shortly after learning the identity of his wife's lover, Luis Toledo arrived at her workplace. It's approximately 9 a.m. on October 22nd. Luis Toledo and his wife have a conversation the details of which we cannot know for sure. You see, what the defendant later tells the police should be viewed by you with skepticism. What we know for sure is that a conversation occurred and that he left the building peacefully. By 1 p.m., the defendant had exchanged several telephone calls with Kevin Dredden, his wife's lover. You'll hear from Mr. Dredden about those conversations. And through his testimony, you'll get a sense of how things were building throughout the day. Shortly after 1 p.m., the same day, Louis Toledo returned to American Canine to confront his wife and her lover. You'll hear that he was granted access to the building because Louis Toledo was recognized as the husband of an employee. You'll hear that once inside, he created a scene. He traveled the halls yelling about his wife's misdeeds. It was a public spectacle, and it quickly grew heated. Before it was completely out of control, Jessica Vandegrift, the receptionist at the front desk that day, announced that she was calling the police. And as officers arrive, the in-car video shows Louis Toledo's silver Saturn speeding from the parking lot. The text messages that follow that exchange are more heated than ever. Accusations, name-calling, promises of divorce. The evidence will show that the situation has become volatile and that the marriage is completely over. Any hopes that the defendant had of repairing what had occurred are now dashed. After work, Jasenia and the defendant met at her mother's house, the home of Felicita Perez. They were going to talk through how it is that they were going to split apart. And through the testimony of Miss Perez, you'll hear roughly how that conversation went. Because of evidentiary rules, she won't be able to repeat exactly what was said. But through her testimony, you'll get a sense of the conversation occurring within her home. Around 6:30 that night, Louis Toledo left her house. That is the last time that we're able to track his location and track his activity. After the event occurred, investigators requested the cellular data and the tower data associated with the defendant's phone. In an effort to follow his movements and potentially locate the bodies of these three individuals, they searched his phone records for answers. What they found was nothing. Absolutely nothing. For whatever reason, his cell phone stopped connecting as he left Felicia's house that night. Investigators will tell you that the cellular records show that his phone was turned off. The last tracking data that investigators have for his phone show his location around the home of Felicita Perez at approximately 6:30 on the night of October 22nd, 2013. And then he disappeared. And unlike every other witness in this case, let me say that again, unlike every other witness in this case, his phone was never recovered or examined. The defendant is the only person that did not have and could not find his cell phone. Every other person in this case had their device. All of the devices were examined, all communication read, all location data reviewed by investigators. In his interview with the police, the defendant repeatedly tells officers that he went home that night. That after leaving Felicita's house, that he went home. And he waited there for his wife to arrive. Now, there are variations in his story. There are many variations in his story. But whether he packed a bag to leave or merely waited for her return doesn't particularly matter. What the defendant says without any hesitation at all, no hesitation, is that he went home and he stayed home until his wife returned to the house with her children. If we had his cell phone, we could check it, but we don't need to. We don't need his cell phone for this. The text messages and phone activity of his wife tell a completely different story. According to Ms. Perez, Yesenia Suarez remained at her house for about another hour. Yesenia and her children didn't leave until about 7:30 or 7:45. After the conversation ended with her husband, Yesenia stayed there to speak with her mother and discuss the way that her life was headed. Though it had been an upsetting day, the evidence will show that she still didn't fear the man that was about to take her life. As she left her mother's house, she told her mom that she was going home, that she wanted to sleep in her own bed. At 7:26 p.m., Yesenia Suarez placed a 4-second call to her husband. She called him again at 7:45. That call lasted 5 seconds. Another call was placed at 7:47 for 7 seconds. And at 7:49, she sent a text message to the defendant saying, "I'm here, where are you?" A message that wasn't necessary if he was in the house, as he says he was. She continued to call her husband for another 2 hours. Calls at 8:05, 8:11, 8:32, 9:10, and 9:19. She was home, but where was the defendant? To this day, law enforcement cannot answer that question. In fact, law enforcement can't tell you where the defendant was at any point during that night. After he shuts off his phone at 6:30, it's impossible to track him. Law enforcement has no idea where he was. They have no idea what he was doing. Based upon the phone activity of his wife, it's quite clear that he wasn't at home as he claimed. The only thing that we can tell you for sure is that he arrived at home sometime between 9:19 and 11:54 that evening. The evidence will show that at 6 minutes before midnight, on October 22nd, the defendant sent a message to Kevin Dredden using his wife's phone. In that message, he pretends to be his wife, and he tells her lover that they need to speak, asking if they can meet in person, trying to lure him out. The way that we know Luis Toledo sent this message is twofold. First, a cheating woman always knows the name of her lover's wife. In this message, there was a reference to Kevin Dredden's wife, Shelley. Kevin Dredden's wife isn't named Shelley. Kevin Dredden's wife is named Ruby. And that little slip and correction 4 minutes later is enough to show investigators that the defendant had Yesenia's phone, and for whatever reason, that he was trying to lure out the lover and control her communication. These are things that the defendant had no choice to admit during his second interview with police. Back and forth went the text messages and calls that night. As with other messages in this case, law enforcement was able to retrieve the messages from the cellular device of Yesenia Suarez. They were also able to cross-reference the conversation from the cellular device of her lover, Kevin Dredden, who later gave his phone to the police after learning that she had disappeared and that the children had as well. Further, the SMS tracker that the defendants installed on her phone was recording everything and was later accessed to demonstrate what had occurred that night. Between 12:01 and 12:23, Kevin Dredden placed 11 unanswered calls to Yesenia Suarez's mobile device. It was only when he threatened to call their boss, a man named Pete Owen, who will also testify in this trial, that he got a response from the mobile device of Yesenia Suarez. Again, it was the defendant sending texts from his wife's phone. Whatever was happening between the two of them in that house, the only thing we can be reasonably certain of is that it involved the affair, and the defendant was in control of his wife's communication with the world. You'll have the opportunity to see the phone activity and read the text messages. It's no stretch to say that the messages that were sent that night are an odd phrasing compared to the normal way that Yesenia Suarez spoke. Because he was concerned for her safety, Kevin Dredden called her device. 2 minutes later, she returned that call and had a conversation that lasted 14 minutes and 13 seconds. On the stand, Mr. Dredden will only be able to describe the conversation in generalities. Evidentiary rules don't allow him to discuss exactly what the victim said to him, but he'll be able to describe her manner well enough to give you a sense of the situation that evening. And when the call ended at 1:03 a.m. on October 23rd, 2013, that was the last time anyone ever heard from Yesenia Suarez and her two children, Elijah Otto and Toledo Otto. The events that occurred next can really only be described by the defendant. By the time you hear his version of what occurred, the evidence presented will give you every reason to doubt his account. So let me start in an entirely different place. Yesenia Suarez and her mother have an extremely close relationship. Many would look at them and describe the two of them and their interaction more as best friends than mother-daughter. For years, they've had the practice of talking on the phone every morning. As Felicia rounds the corner and leaves the subdivision in which she lives, she passes her daughter's house. Each day, she looks at the home in the hopes of seeing her daughter and her grandchildren, the people she so dearly loves. This was her practice in 2013. Now she looks at the house much differently. On the morning of October 23rd, 2013, Ms. Perez rounded the corner and looked at the house and proceeded to work. Consistent with her daily ritual, she called her daughter. She'll tell you she had an ominous feeling that morning. She'll tell you that the events the day before had left her unsettled. She'll tell you that she was hoping that a conversation with her daughter would fix all that. That conversation never occurred. Felicia Perez called her daughter's phone that morning and received no answer. So she called again. And she called again. And she called again. And she continued to call, each time getting no answer. A growing feeling inside her that something was wrong. Over and over, she called her daughter's cell phone. Then she called the house phone. No response. Then she called the children's school. Then she called 911. She met the police at her daughter's home that morning, the morning of October 23rd, 2013. She met Deputy Wayne Miller of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office at exactly 9:43. In fact, she beat him to the house. Just next door, a 20-year-old kid named Tyshawn Jackson. 20-year-old kid named Tyshawn Jackson sat on the front porch and he placed a call to his girlfriend. The defendant returned to his home that morning at 9:50, which was odd because he had just started a new job in Lake Mary, and he was in Deltona at his home at 9:50 a.m. He had not been summoned by his mother-in-law. He had not been summoned by the police. He pulled into the driveway 7 minutes after the police arrived. He didn't seem to understand why Felicita Perez was so upset. The story he first told police was that he was traveling to work that morning and he realized that he was running out of gas. He said his fuel light came on, alerting them that he only had miles to go. And rather than going to the nearest gas station, something on almost every corner in Lake Mary, he turned around and he drove 15 to 20 minutes home. What the evidence will actually show is that this was his first lie to the police. His vehicle was towed from the scene that morning. Later, investigators turned on the vehicle, checked his gauges. What they found is that he had a quarter tank of gas. What they found is that the indicator light did not come on. It was clear to everyone who was there that morning that he was supposed to be at work. He had started that job in the call center just a few days earlier, and they required his attendance at 9 a.m. But somehow, inexplicably, here he was. Luis Toledo was standing in his front yard with law enforcement and a hysterical Felicita Perez. When he gave law enforcement a tour of his home that morning, the smell of cleaning fluids was overwhelming. Investigators will testify and describe the smell of fresh cleaning. They'll describe that the grout in the bathroom, in the master bathroom, was still wet. And they'll describe a tiny spot of blood that proved to be the defendant's undoing. You see, what the defendant told the officers that morning was that he had been arguing with his wife the night before. The incident in Lake Mary at her workplace had been well documented. The incident or the argument at his mother-in-law's house had been observed by individuals. He couldn't deny those things. And so he tells the officers that the argument continued when they got home. That at some point in the night, he left the house and visited a nearby cemetery. The defendant said it's where he goes to clear his mind. His parents are buried there, and it's his place of solace. And when he returned home, rather than entering the house and dealing with his wife, what he told officers is that he chose to sleep in his car. That the morning sun caused him to stir. He opened the house and found that everyone was gone. So he showered and he went to work until his gas light came home. And that's why he drove 15 to 20 minutes back to his house. That's why he was there with the police, who were asking questions about his missing wife and her children. Luis Toledo told this version of events to officers on scene. Later in the day, he was arrested and he told a similar version to investigators. In the intervening hours, a regional search effort had been coordinated to find this young mother and her precious babies. A little while ago, I mentioned Luis Toledo's neighbor, a young man by the name of Tyshawn Jackson. If you recall, he was placing a phone call to his girlfriend moments after the police arrived next door. From his vantage point on the porch, he could see the activities of the morning. As more officers arrived, he placed more calls to his girlfriend. He placed a lot of calls to his mom. Though he initially denied knowledge of anything that had transpired, Tyshawn Jackson knew a lot of things about what his neighbor had done. When the defendant was arrested and removed from the scene, he came forward with the information. And here's what he told officers. Early on the morning of October 23rd, at 6:11 a.m., he was asleep in his bed. Louis Toledo knocked on his bedroom window, waking him up, and asked Tyshawn Jackson for help. The defendant needed to move his wife's car, a black Honda Accord, and he asked Tyshawn Jackson to follow him and give him a return ride home. The defendant had been attending barber school with Mr. Jackson since June. It wasn't uncommon for them to ride places together. They had even started to develop a friendship during that time. Before barber school, they had lived next to each other for years and never said hi, never done more than wave as they went to the mailbox. But on October 23rd, just after dawn, Tyshawn Jackson followed the defendant from his home. Louis Toledo was driving Jesse's Honda, and Tyshawn Jackson followed behind him in the silver Saturn that had been seen speeding away from American K-9 just the afternoon before. The further they drove, the more Tyshawn Jackson became impatient. The evidence will show that he had been awakened by the defendant and asked for only a quick favor. Now they were in another county, and he had no idea where they were going. Finally, the defendant pulled into a parking lot, and Tyshawn Jackson followed suit. As the sun was coming up, Tyshawn Jackson turned the corner and the headlights illuminated the area. The young man saw his friend and his neighbor wiping down the black Honda Accord with a rag, removing items from its interior, stuffing them into a bag, and then shoving them into the silver Saturn. When he first talked to the police about what he had seen, this was a missing persons case. He figured that they'd find Jesse in just a little while. And so what he told them was that the vehicle had been dumped in a Publix parking lot over in Seminole County. Hours later, when it started to get dark, the day had ended, and he started to become worried about those children, he felt the need to share more. He initiated a second conversation with officers, and he revealed what he had seen the defendant doing in that parking lot. He further told officers that along the route home, the defendant dumped the Honda Accord trunk liner, cleaning products, and unknown items into a dumpster in Seminole County. Additionally, Tyshawn Jackson shared with investigators an important statement that this defendant made as they rode in silence from Seminole County back to Deltona. Tyshawn Jackson described the only words uttered by Louis Toledo that morning. He told investigators what the defendant said. He told investigators the way that the defendant was acting. He told the investigators that Louis Toledo said, "Only I snapped." As they got close to home, Tyshawn Jackson wanted out of the car. He requested to be dropped at a 7-Eleven just down the street from his house. He bought a soda and something to smoke, and he walked home. A few minutes later, the police arrived, and his telephone records will confirm the emotions that he was feeling that morning. You see, Tyshawn Jackson also gave up his phone to investigators. And what investigators learned is that he called his mom 11 times in less than 2 hours. The evidence will show you that Tyshawn Jackson provided valuable information to the police. In fact, without his assistance, law enforcement could not have retrieved any of the evidence associated with the defendant's wrongdoing, nor could they have confronted the defendant about what happened. You see, if it weren't for Tyshawn Jackson, Louis Toledo would have been able to continue telling the police that his family left him sleeping in the car. It was only when he was presented with these key pieces of evidence that his wife's car had been located in another county, abandoned in a Publix parking lot, evidence that these items were removed from a dumpster. It was only then that the defendant changed his story. All day on October 23rd, the defendant led investigators to believe that his wife had merely left him, and that if she couldn't be found, she was simply missing. Investigators even visited him in the middle of the night. They went to him in the middle of the night asking for help to locate his children. Her children, an important distinction. Asking for his help in locating her children. This was a request that he denied. It was only on the 24th when photographs of the evidence collected through the assistance of Tyshawn Jackson that the defendant gave any other version of the events than his wife had simply left and taken the kids with her. It was in that moment that the photographs were laid on the table before him that he knew who had been speaking to the police. Over the course of this trial, you'll have the opportunity to watch the defendant's evolving statements to police. The evidence will show that there's a theme that develops over time. You'll notice that all of his statements are marked with the same response. Admit what you cannot deny what you cannot admit. In that first moment with law enforcement on October 24th, 2013, the defendant offered a statement that he killed his wife during a marital dispute. The evidence will show that his claim is that her death was the final blow in a situation of domestic violence. And in this situation he describes, he places himself as the victim. He says that she was attacking him, and only when he could take no more did he karate chop her to the throat, and that she died on the carpet moments later. He goes on to say that Tyshawn Jackson, the very same person who had given this information to the police and all of this evidence, that Tyshawn Jackson was in his home that night when all of this occurred. He says that Tyshawn was there when he killed his wife. He says that Tyshawn panicked, and that this 20-year-old kid who lives next door simply took the children from the room, took them into the bathroom, and hit them in the head with an axe until they were dead. That's what the defendant says. He says that after they were dead, that Tyshawn Jackson took control of the situation. That Tyshawn Jackson ordered him to clean the house and how it was to be done. That Tyshawn Jackson was the person who disposed of the bodies and hid the evidence in this case. The defendant offers this statement to law enforcement on day 2. He only offers it after being confronted with the evidence of his own guilt. Evidence stacking up before him in the form of photographs and witness accounts for things that he cannot explain. You'll have an opportunity to watch his statement unfold. You'll have an opportunity to judge his credibility. The state urges you to do exactly that. Consider the way he addresses the investigators. Consider the information he provides and when. The judge will later inform you about individuals who have given varying accounts of the truth. There'll be an instruction on the law. And understand that this discrepancy in the defendant's statement, it won't be the only discrepancy in his version of events. As his story unfolds from version A, she left, to version B, I killed her, you'll also know, or you'll also likely notice, that there are internal inconsistencies within the report of what occurred. His statements don't even line up. From hour to hour, minute to minute, what he tells investigators is not consistent. You'll also hear that the details that he provides to law enforcement are inconsistent with the evidence in this case. And then, on October 26th, there's another statement that the defendant gives to law enforcement. 3 days after his arrest, 3 days, the defendant again offers version B. But in an emotional and highly charged moment during this interview, he makes a startling admission. In that moment, the defendant slips. In that moment, he doesn't place the blame on Ty. When the defendant is asked where the bodies can be located, his answer is a simple one. His answer is, I'll never tell you where the bodies are. Not that Tyshawn Jackson hid them and I don't know. I'll never tell you where the bodies are. You'll hear from the investigators that made an effort to determine whether Tyshawn Jackson had been present for anything, for any of this account. Whether Tyshawn Jackson was responsible for the murders of the children, whether Tyshawn Jackson was responsible for the disposal of the bodies as the defendant claimed. What you'll hear is that there's absolutely no evidence that the neighbor was in the defendant's home that morning. In contrast, you'll learn that the blood of Talia Otto, the little girl, was located throughout the master bathroom of the defendant's home. It wasn't just one spot of blood. It was the little spot that had been seen by the first responders that led to his undoing. But you'll learn that there were many, many more. You'll learn that the defendant attempted but failed to clean up her blood. Additionally, you'll learn that the little girl's blood was found on the toe of his left shoe, a drop down. You'll also learn that the trunk mat that Luis Toledo pulled from the Honda Accord and threw in the dumpster in Seminole County, the trunk mat that he discarded in the dumpster, it contained the blood of the little girl. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a long trial. The length of my opening statement should give you some ideas of the complexities involved. But make no mistake about it, the evidence will demonstrate beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt that Luis Toledo was responsible for the murder of these three individuals. As we discussed during jury selection, there's a difference between first-degree and second-degree murder in the state of Florida. The difference lies in the mindset of the killer. The judge will give you a full explanation of the law, and it won't occur until the end of the case, probably. As jurors, it will be your responsibility to decide who killed these individuals and why. From the state's perspective, the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence will overwhelmingly demonstrate that Luis Toledo killed his wife during a heated argument in the home. We will prove that the defendant acted with ill will, that he acted with hatred, and that he acted with spite in performing an act that was indifferent to human life. Essentially, we will prove that by striking his wife in the throat, he did not care if she died. And that once that killing was complete, once that was accomplished, that Luis Toledo, and only Luis Toledo, had the motive and opportunity to kill those young children. The evidence will show that he killed Michael Elijah Otto, and he did it with premeditation. Similarly, the evidence will show that he killed 9-year-old Talia Otto, and he did it with premeditation. The evidence presented by the state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the death of these children occurred in an attempt for him to escape justice. The evidence will show that Luis Toledo killed Yesenia Suarez's children to eliminate them as witnesses, whether they saw what occurred that night or simply that they were going to wake up the next morning and ask, where was mommy? He killed them to eliminate them as witnesses. And in that respect, their death can only be characterized as first-degree murder. Ladies and gentlemen, please be patient with us as we deliver this evidence to you. It is a long and complicated method of proof. But when this case is over, the state is confident that you will see this case as we do. And we will ask you to return a verdict. In fact, we will ask you to return the only verdict, both supported by the law and the evidence. We will ask you to find the defendant guilty of the second-degree murder of Yesenia Suarez's 28-year-old wife. We will ask you to find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder for the 8-year-old killing, or the killing of the 8-year-old Michael Elijah Otto. We will ask you to find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of her daughter, 9-year-old Talia Otto. And we will ask you to find the defendant guilty of tampering with evidence for his attempts to frustrate justice in this case. Not only was he responsible for the dumping of items related to these crimes, but he's also responsible for the complete and total disappearance of these people. If you find that he removed, concealed, or disposed of anything, whether it be blood or a body, then you must find him guilty of that crime as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant will be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of every charge that the state has offered. I thank you for your time and attention this morning. I thank you for your time and attention that you will give to this case and the evidence that we will present to you over the coming weeks. Thank you very much for your service on this jury.